Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad. Ve'ahavta et Yahweh Elohecha b'kol levavcha u'kol nafshecha u'kol ma'odecha. Ve'hayu hadevarim ha'eleh asher anochi matzavecha hayom al lavanecha. Vashinomtam lavanecha v'dibarta bam b'shivtecha b'vetecha uvlechtecha v'derech uv'shaktecha u'kumecha. וכשרתם לאות על ידך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על משושות ביתך ובשעריך. Hear, O Israel, Yahweh your Elohim, Yahweh is one. You shall love Yahweh your Elohim with all your heart, with all your being, and with all your might. And these words which I am commanding you today shall be in your heart. And you shall impress them upon your children, and you shall speak of them when you sit in your house, when you lie down, when you rise up. When you walk, by the way, when you lie down, when you rise up. And you shall write them as a sign on your hands, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. And you shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates.
On the doorposts of your house. See? Hallelujah. All right. Shabbat shalom, everyone, and greetings to the people on the Outreach Ministry. I'm going to do something a little bit different today. Not going to have a lot of scriptures, but I think I'm going to give you some information which some of you probably have. Some of you have probably read a lot of this material, but not everybody has. But the material that I'm going to talk about is the history between the time that Israel came out of Babylon and the time of Messiah. And that history, if you understand it, if you get the gist of it, will help you to understand a lot of things that are going on in the New Testament, a lot of the things that Yeshua says, a lot of the conflicts that you see between Yeshua and the scribes and the Pharisees, for instance, and even some of the little minute details about some of the prejudices that the Jews had against the Samaritans, or that some of the Jews had against the Galileans. A lot of that has to do with the history between the testaments, if you will. So it's called the Intertestament history. A lot of this general history, and it does include a lot of the Jewish history, you can find on fsmith.com. I think I copied that right. I hope I did. And what you get when you go there, if you go to there's a timeline of world history. And what you get there is not just what I'm going to give you, but you find out also what was going on in China, in India, in other parts of the world, which really doesn't concern what happens with the Jews and with Yeshua when he comes about. So we know that in 586, and by the way, one of the jumping off points was the fact that we just finished reading all of the prophets. We read through all the prophets and discussed the prophets before Israel went into captivity, before Israel was dispersed. That is the northern tribes. In Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, some of that has to do with Judah going into captivity. And then we read all the minor prophets, beginning with Daniel, which prophesied some very important things with regard to doctrines that we believe today. Now, I'll point those out when we come to them, okay? So, and then we read Ezra and Nehemiah and the Chronicles. That was a repeat of the history of known Israel and Judah up to the time of their coming out of Babylon. So, in 586, just by way of review, Judah fell to Babylon and was taken to Babylon. Actually, physically, most of them taken to Babylon. A few maybe left behind. Some maybe went to Samaria. Some of them had, scattered in various places, but most of them went to Babylon. And you can read about that actually in the scripture in 2 Kings chapter 25. 2 Kings chapter 25 and the parallel in the 2 Chronicles. 586. In 539, and of course that was the Babylonian Empire, right, that they went to, which was the head of gold in the image there's where Daniel comes in the image that Nebuchadnezzar saw, and it was interpreted by Daniel. The head of gold, he said, was Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon. And then there was another kingdom that was going to come down below, and it was the chest in that image, and that chest was the Medo-Persian Empire. And in 539 BCE, we're talking about BCE. I'm not going to repeat that over and over again, but in 539, the Medo-Persian Empire took over the Babylonian Empire, and it was the chest. So it was the second of the empires that were going to come and be ruling over the earth. And when they did that, they took over the captives from Judah, because Judah hadn't been captive yet for 70 years. That was what was prophesied. So that was 539. In 538, however, Cyrus, who was the king of the Medo-Persian Empire, and totally in charge now, the Babylonians there, they defeated them. It isn't that Babylon disappeared, because it didn't. Babylon continues as all of these empires, or the spirit of all these empires continues right down to the end of the age, as foretold by Daniel. So this second one, the chest, was the Medo-Persian Empire, and Cyrus, in his second year, in 538, made a decree that allowed some captives to return to Jerusalem and begin rebuilding the temple. And we do read about that in Kings and Chronicles, and also in Ezra and Nehemiah. So this is where the kickoff of the intertestamental history begins. We have this part. In 478, this is another, 60 years later, Xerxes, who was the king of Persia, also known in our scriptures as Ahasuerus, makes Esther his queen. She is of the tribe of Yehuda, a Jew. We're going to use that word Jew, and hopefully we all know and understand that this term Jew was applied to the Yehudim, and it was throughout history, and a lot of this history that we're going to read here, because we're going to read a lot of this history we're going to read from Smith's timeline and on the website. So he made Esther his queen. So she was one of those Jews, if you will, those Yehudim, who were taken to Babylon from Jerusalem captive. Okay? She and her family, her uncle Mordecai, which you will remember. In 458, 20 years later, the Persians are allowing Yahwists. And by the way, that is a direct quote from that website. That's what he called them. They were allowing Yahwists, priests, to return from Babylon to Judah, Yehuda, Judea, as the Romans came to call it, and urging the priests to maintain order in accordance with their teachings. Okay? This was a common practice by the Persians regarding subject peoples. So they would conquer a people and they would say, well, manage your own affairs. And so what was the point of conquering them? Well, they had to pay taxes. They had to pay taxes to the Persian government. The Persians do not allow the Jews a king, which is okay with the high priest in Jerusalem, because the high priests in Jerusalem, who were probably descendants of Levi, but were mixed with the Yehudim and taken captive and are coming back, and probably Ezra was a Levite, they didn't like the mixing of the king with the priest anyway. They didn't like that. So it was okay with them. In Jerusalem, the high priest Ezra arrives with 1,800 others and finds assimilations. In other words, the people who had stayed behind were just being, assimilated. He begins to organize Judaic law along the lines of identity with Yahweh worship, which we would say, he's putting it as Yahweh worship. We would say he's trying to reinstitute the culture of living Yah's way. Okay? That's really what that is meaning. Men are soon to be asked to expel from their homes their foreign wives. Judaic law is to be based on an assembled 5 books purportedly written by Moses, purportedly, and we would say, well, we certainly agree with that. And of course, we know what those are: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And then reinstituting the Yahwist culture, what do we find their attitude is toward other religions? What did Yahweh tell them? You don't do what the pagans do to their mighty ones. And in fact, when you conquer lands, you wipe them out. So an intolerance toward other faiths, religions is encouraged. So that was 458. So here we are, we're coming out of this Babylonian captivity. We still have Ezra here. He rewrites the history of kings and calls it the Chronicles. And so there are a lot of parallels between those two, a little bit of difference, but not much. In 445, the Hebrew priest Ezra reads the book of the law to the people in Jerusalem. So he's still going, 445. Now there are a lot of other things that are going on. As we're going to find here, the Greeks and the Romans begin to clash. And we're going to find in just a little while, we're going to find Alexander the Great and what influence he had. It wasn't a very long influence, but it was a lasting influence. In 360, so this is 128 years, almost 130 years after the first captives came back from Babylon, about 130 years later, and we don't read this anywhere in the scripture. There are no scriptures about this, but there's history about it. One of the historians that wrote about this was a Jewish man from the tribe of Judah who defected to the Romans. And how many of you have read Josephus? I know that you have, but not many of us have read the entirety of Josephus. So a lot of the intertestamental history comes from Josephus, though he wasn't an eyewitness of the early. He does verify it, and he used various Greek and Roman sources that he used to compile his information. So Jerusalem in 360 has been rebuilt, and the power of Judaism's hereditary priesthood, which wasn't really Judah's, was it? Judaism's priesthood, the heredity was from Levi. From Levi. Lewi. It's firmly established in 360. If a father finds his son, and then it gives us some of the things that they did that were kind of striking to people who are writing this history, probably Smith in this case. If a father finds his son rebellious and disobedient, he can take him to the city elders and have him stoned to death. Remember, who is government is over them now? The Persian. This is the Persian Empire. They're still in the Persian Empire in 360. But remember what I told you? The Persians allowed the local people to take care of their own affairs. So they allowed the Jews, Yehudim, they allowed the Jews and the Levites, Israel at this time, to live according to their laws and to carry out their laws. So if a father finds his son rebellious and disobedient, he can take him to the city elders and have him stoned to death. Is that in the Torah? No. Oh, yes, it is. Absolutely it is. It is in the Torah. So they did that. What he's showing is They were keeping the Torah. In a dispute that goes to court, a man judged wicked is whipped, but no more than 40 times. So here's where now that is, I don't know, is the 39 stripes in Torah? I mean, you could punish somebody who is judged to be wicked. Actually, there are Torah scriptures that say if you find one among you who is trying to get the people to worship false deities, what are you supposed to do to him? Same thing you did to that rebellious son, stone him. This is Torah, and they were allowing them to keep the Torah. Priest scribes have described the Hebrews as descendants of Noah and Noah's forebearers as the first family of humankind. So this is what was being taught by the priest caste. And the priest scribes described the Elohim of the Jews as supreme above all other mighty ones. Well, we would expect that, right? If they're being allowed to carry out their culture, we would expect that that's what they would do. Moses is described as living during the time of the kingdoms of Moab and Edom, and Abraham is described as living when the Chaldeans were in possession of Sumer. Well, where in the world did they get that? From Genesis, right? Jewish law permits slavery, but the enslavement of a fellow Jew is restricted to 7 years. So these are just a few things that Smith pulled out here to show what was being done in 360 when the Israelites, mainly Yahudim and Levites, and maybe some Benjamites, when they were all classified as Jews and keeping Judaism, and they were allowed to keep their Judaism according to the Torah. 360. In 337, outside of Judea, actually Judea is a term that the Romans put on Palestine. It was called Palestine, or the East, or whatever. But anyway, these are things that are going on that I'm going to tell you about that are going to come to influence what was happening in what came to be known as Judea later. So this is in this period of time that we don't have scriptural history from Babylon to Messiah. In the Greek Empire, the Greek world, the Greeks haven't taken over yet, but they're starting to have conflicts with the Persians. Philip II of Greece has created a strong and unified nation in Macedonia. Macedonia, which would be to the west of the Persian Empire, Asia Minor. Okay, north of Israel, all the way through to Asia Minor, because right across, when you go to Asia Minor and you go as far west as you can go in Asia Minor, and what do you come to? The Straits of Bosporus. And what's on the other side? Greece. So in other words, what we're seeing here is that Greece begins to expand to the east. He is devoted to Greek culture and has hired Aristotle to tutor his son. Alexander, his son is Alexander. Philip II of Macedonia or Greece, his son is Alexander, and Aristotle is his tutor. He imposes unity on the divided Greek city-states, and this is what causes Greece to come together. There's lots of division, and he imposes unity. And he creates the Hellenic League. Hellenic is another name for Greek. Comes from Helen, I guess. I don't know if it's Helen of Troy, but probably has something to do with that. And it meets for the first time in the city of Corinth. Corinth is going to be a major city in the New Testament, isn't it? So this is something that is happening in the Greek world that is going to affect what comes down in the New Testament. In 336, Philip is assassinated, and his son Alexander becomes king. In 334, so now we're just progressing a few, and there are other things that are happening. There are always these conflicts on the Western Front with Rome, because Rome was where? In Italy. And Rome didn't have an empire yet, okay? They probably weren't even they were just tribes. These are tribes that are coming together to form these nations and then empires eventually. In 334, Alexander begins warring against Persia. So Alexander is not pushing toward the Romans. He is pushing west. He is pushing east toward the Persians. He and his army moving through the Persian Empire from Asia Minor to Egypt, across Persia. Remember where Persia is, where Iran and Iraq are today, and into the Hindu Kush and the Indus Valley, all the way to India. All the way to India. So that's the direction that Alexander is going. In 332, he's been king for a couple of years. Alexander the Great, he's the belly and the thighs of Nebuchadnezzar's image, the belly and the thighs. So we've gone from the head, Babylon, to the chest, Medo-Persia. Now we're in the belly and the thighs, and we're in Greece. And of course, Daniel said that was what? An empire. So what happens? He conquers Egypt and Palestine. What's in Palestine? Now, they may not have called it Palestine, but in history, this is where Judea is. This is where the Jews are. This is where the Jews who came out of Babylon have been established as a people, not a real powerful people. In fact, some of the captives of various peoples that have come through Palestine have actually placed peoples, captives, not Jews. They could have been scattered Israelites. They could be partly Jews. In Galilee, got a picture of where Galilee is? North of Jerusalem. In Samaria, a little bit southwest, but still closer to Jerusalem. And a place called Idumea. Idumea. Where was Idumea? It was in the desert. It was occupied by nomads called the Nabateans. Nabateans, though they were nomads, they were a very important part of the economy of this area because they had control of the route from the east, the spice route. Was their main spice? We might see what they controlled, and all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. And they eventually did establish cities. Well, there were some captives that were taken and put down there among them, and so they got all mixed up. And some of them were Israelites. So he has Palestine. And this is when, 332, Alexander, when Hellenization occurs. Anybody need a little refresher on what Hellenization is? Everybody know what it is? No? Hellenization just simply means he was imposing Greek culture, which was very different from Israeli culture, right? Is Yahwistic culture. What are some of the features? Well, they had great poets, they had great literary individuals, they had architecture, and they had a lot of pagan gods. I mean, you've heard of them, Zeus. They had the pantheon, they had they had a lot of games. That's where the Olympics started. It's where we learned to cut our hair and trim our beard. The Romans did it too, but the Romans may have gotten it from the Greeks. Yeah. Okay? So On October 1st of 331, Alexander defeats an army of Persia's king Darius III and his Greek mercenaries at the Battle of Gaugamela. Okay, so 331. Here is the belly and the thighs of Nebuchadnezzar's statue. Here is the Greek Empire, Greece, the Grecian Empire. This is the goat that pushed at the other ones. And it was very powerful, widespread. He was a great soldier, a great general, a great military leader. And who knows what would have happened if he would have lived longer. 323, Alexander returns to his new capital. Remember, he started this campaign in 332. That's when he became king. In 323, 9 years later, he returned to his capital, his new capital. And where did he put it? In the head, Babylon. He wants cooperation and brotherhood across his empire and has plans for expanded commerce and extending his rule to Italy. So what's he going to bump into when he goes toward Italy? The Romans. Okay. They're not very powerful right now, so he can think that way. However, in 323, he has all these aspirations, and he dies at age 32. So whether he died or whether someone killed him, they did a lot of that assassinating of kings back then. Myth is still the dominant way of considering the past, and many myths about Alexander are to develop. So you have lots of different stories on how he perished, why he didn't live as long as he did, anywhere from venereal disease to assassination. So you got lots of things going on there. When he dies, his kingdom is divided into 4. Egypt, the Ptolemies, and these are the families who took over the rulership of these areas, because it was actually too big and too broad for one person to handle. So the Ptolemies ruled in Egypt, the Seleucids in Syria. Everybody knows where Syria is, right? Where is Syria in relationship to Palestine? Right there, right on the northeast border, okay? And actually it was pretty much across. It was Lebanon and Syria. So that was the Seleucids. And you've heard those before. You've heard of those before, probably. And we're going to hear about them again, because they're going to impact what happens to the Jews, which in our case of this history discussion today, the Jews are not just Yehudim. The Jews here are the Yehudim, the Benjamites, the Levites, everybody who came back from Babylon, and even some of the other Israelites who were coming back to the land from the diaspora. Now, things happen here with some of these empires, and there are people going out too, emigration. Not immigration, but emigration. So the diaspora actually continued to grow. It's estimated that back at about this time, there were probably 8 million Yehudim, Israelites. They called them Jews, 8 million Jews. And about 2 million of those only were in Judea. The other 6 million were scattered throughout these empires. And that seems a little high to me for just Yehudim, but when you consider all the other Israelites, not so high. Today, anybody know how many Yehudim supposedly are in Israel today? I think it's 14. I think it's 14 million. But, this is how many years later? And, of course, they had to restart in the 1940s. So the Seleucids were in Syria. The Antigonids were in Macedonia. So that was the part that went over to Greece. And the Attalids were in Pergamum. So those were those four divisions. Now, the only ones that really are significant in the history of Israel, quote unquote Israel, are the Ptolemies in Egypt and the Seleucids in Syria, because of the Seleucids because of their proximity, the Ptolemies because there were so many Israelites that fled to Egypt. Israel always went to Egypt, didn't they? They always went. There were so many that they made up about a third of the city of Alexandria. Alexandria was a big place there was a lot of conflict down there, because wherever the Jews went, wherever the Yehudim, quote unquote Jews, wherever they went, if they were keeping Torah, they were in conflict with the pagan societies, because the Torah taught them to be separate, to be set apart. And the pagans hated that. They tolerated each other, but they didn't like somebody else telling them that their mighty one was better than the mighty one that the pagans worshipped. They didn't like that. And the fact that the Yehudim, the Jews, the Israelites that were in those areas, they had to keep the Sabbath. So they had to, that would make it very difficult for them to be in their armies. Armies were a big thing then. We even have a little bit of that today, because true believers that, come in and want to keep the Sabbath, if they have association with the military, if we have a draft, there's a conflict there. There's a big conflict. They were exclusive. They didn't want to have anything to do with the government. And these pagan governments, remember what I told you about Greece? Greece had the practice of letting the local ethnic groups handle their own situations. And the Romans come along, and they do the same. But we're not quite to Rome yet. So the Ptolemies in Egypt, big population. The Seleucids in Syria, proximity, close proximity. And at this time, the Greeks were fighting the Parthians. Now, we have books of history that show us that the Parthians may well have been a lot of Israelites that had been scattered earlier. At least they went there and they mixed with the population. And they didn't like the Greeks, and they're not going to like the Romans. In fact, they're going to fight a big battle against the Romans when the Romans do get on the move, and the Romans are always going to hate them for it. But the Parthians keep coming back. They push at the Greeks, they're going to push at the Romans, and they're going to, for a while, they're going to conquer that little country that was allowed to exist because of with what we call a client king, who was allied with either they didn't like to ally with the Greeks, by the way. There were some in the Israelite community who didn't mind allying with the Greeks when the Greeks allowed them to keep their thing. But when they began the Hellenization thing, then they started these Olympic Games, and these games were done, guess how? In the buff. So this is where, if the sons of Israelites were going to be in these games, they're going to have a marked difference in the buff from these pagans. And so this is where we find in the history, and we do see this in history, I think Josephus reports on it too, that many Jewish Israelite men tried to make themselves uncertain, to reverse the operation, in other words, so they could participate in these games and not look weird. Okay, so that's part of the Hellenization. In 322, Alexander's Persian wife, so in making his conquests, like so many pagans did, they find a pretty woman, not so much even the pagans. David did the same thing, didn't he? He had a Persian wife, Roxana, and she gave birth to Alexander's child, Alexander IV. Alexander's generals have sworn to keep Alexander's empire together, but for some Macedonians, it's unthinkable that their king should be the son of a barbarian Asian woman. In 316, Alexander the Great's mother, Olympias, has claimed rule in Macedonia, has raised an army, and is supporting the legitimacy of Roxanne's son, Alexander IV. Macedonia is overrun by her opponents, and she is killed. In 311, so you see these civil wars that are going on. I mean, when Yeshua says, there shall be wars and rumors of wars, my goodness, the wars and the rumors of wars that went on, civil wars within Greece and later within Rome, are just astounding. Alexander IV in 311 is executed, and his mother Roxana also dies. And, you know, he just says also dies. Put to death, also dies. Okay. Former subordinates of Alexander the Great have been fighting each other and are dividing his empire. Alexander's former bodyguard Ptolemy, remember that word? The Ptolemies ruling Egypt, is making himself king of Egypt. So there's where that faction goes. In 305, we're still in the Greek, the Macedonian Empire. A former officer in Alexander's army, Seleucus, considers himself emperor across Persia. This is where the Seleucids come from, and into the lands east of Persia. He attempts to recover lands taken by Chandragupta. Easy for me to say, right? Chandragupta, that has been a part of Alexander's empire. Chandragupta turns back Seleucus' drive, and Seleucus is forced to agree to peace terms, and this fellow then conquers into the Himalayas. He just ends up going east and leaves the rest of the Greek Empire alone. In 301, he abdicates in favor of one of his sons and withdraws from with a Janus sage. That I guess that's a religion, to a religious retreat. There, while appealing to his mighty one for relief from a drought, he fasts to death. The 40-day fast. Okay, so that's 300. So this is these are the things. There's not a whole lot happening with Israel, quote unquote Israel at this time, but they're existing there. They're being pretty much left alone until somebody gets eyes on them. All right, and that's through 300, up to about 300. Now, not a lot going on for that 100 years between 300 and 200. From 200 to 197, we're still BCE, Rome has become more powerful, and Rome always was having civil wars. Who's going to be the leader? Not a thing like human nature at all. Rome in 200, from 200 to 197, Rome intervenes in a conflict between a reformer, Philip V of Macedonia, still the Greek Empire, and conservatives ruling Greek city-states. The Romans win, and Philip agrees to stop interventions and to pay war wages. So there begins to be this interaction between Greece and Rome. Greece still the more powerful empire. 193 to 190, Rome sees expansion by Antiochus III of Syria. He's a Seleucid, as a threat to its power, and remembers that Antiochus has given refuge to Hannibal. I don't know if anybody, I never saw the movie Hannibal. It looks too bloody to watch. But Hannibal, of course, was a great warrior who tried to get his own empire, if you will. Rome with allies, or allied with Rhodes, Pergamum, and other Greek cities hostile to Antiochus, and together they defeat Antiochus and his allies. Now Antiochus, that's a name that you all will remember, right, from Maccabees, having to do with, supposedly having to do with the Feast of Hanukkah. I'm going to show you something from history that's a little in conflict with some of the things that you've been taught about Hanukkah. From 175 to 163, the Seleucid king Antiochus IV tries to, now here we come to Israel. Antiochus IV, he's the one who's over this middle empire. It's still Greece, but it's a divided empire now. He's over what the Romans are going to later call Judea, and he tries to force the Jews to abandon their law and adopt Greek culture. I know the notes say Greek. I somehow dropped a K there, so just write that down. That's Greek culture. So this is the ultimate Hellenizing. So how does he try to force the Jews, quote unquote, because it's not just Jews, remember, to abandon their law? He forbids circumcision. He forbids Sabbath, seventh-day Sabbath keeping. Okay? Well, what do you think how do you think the Jews felt about that? Not too good. So keep that in mind, that this is what the Greeks are doing. Why? How is it that from through the Macedonian Empire, or through the Medo-Persian Empire, and through most of the Macedonian Empire, the Jews you don't hear much about them. They just kind of exist because they were given the freedom to do their own stuff. Freedom to do their own stuff. What happens? Well, here comes Antiochus IV, and he tries to force the Jews to abandon their law. And so what does Maccabees tell us about him? Well, eventually he is going to desecrate their temple. He's going to take a statue of Zeus and put it up in there and sacrifice a pig to it. That's what he did. He desecrated the temple. Okay. And that's from 175 to 163, and it's within this period of time, and we're going to see that in just a minute. It's about 167. In 171, Greek cities that fear Macedonia's power have told Rome's Senate that Macedonia, the Greek Empire, is plotting against Rome. Rome's Senate decides on a war against Macedonia's new ruler, Persis, the son of Philip V. So here we got Rome and Greece coming into conflict again. In 168, Rome destroys, so we see the Macedonian Empire, the belly and the thighs starting to crumble. Rome destroys the army of Persis and takes him away as prisoner. Because Epirus was allied with Persis, Rome attacks its towns and villages and carries away 150,000 people whom they sell into slavery. Rome divides Macedonia into 4 republics, forbids contact between the 4, divide and conquer. There's the perfect example of it. Rome takes possession of Macedonia's mines and forests. It's the beginning of Roman annexations east of the Adriatic Sea. In 167, here it is, 167, in that period, the 175 to 163, Antiochus IV of the Seleucid dynasty and empire desecrates the temple. I just told you how he did it. Took an image of Zeus in there, and it may be the same one that's in Rome, by the way, and sacrificed a pig to it. He dedicates the temple in Jerusalem as a shrine to Zeus. He believes that this will be accepted because people readily shift the name of gods and are willing to recognize the one God of the universe by the name Zeus. Well, is that different from today? I mean, pretty much the whole world recognizes the one mighty one as God. The deity of luck, by the way. Not his name at all. In 166, okay, then there was this Jewish, if you will. He may have even been a Levite, a priest, Mattathias. And he didn't like all this Hellenization. So he takes a group to the mountains. And he has at least 3 sons. And his name is Maccabee, by the way, Mattathias, Maccabeus. And so is born out of his distaste and his family's distaste for what the Greeks are doing, and especially Antiochus IV. This is the beginning of the Maccabean rebellion. This is how the Maccabean rebellion comes around. See, why did it take from 500 BCE to 166 for the Jews, Israelites there, because they were allowed their own government? We can understand. So now what happens is they're not being allowed their own government again. Now, from time to time, there were Greek cities that didn't like what the Jews were doing, the Israelites that had come there. And so they would persecute the Jews. They would write literature against the first anti-Semitic literature came from Greece. But always there was a connection with Rome, and the Jews, quote unquote, know who I'm talking about now, the Jews had connections with Rome and would report to Rome what the Greeks were doing, and Rome would come to their aid and make edicts that said, hey, these people, they need to be allowed to circumcise, they need to be allowed to keep the Sabbath, they need to be exempt from the military because that was conflict with the Sabbath, and so on. But see, the Roman Empire hasn't been formed yet, but Rome has gotten some victories over the Greeks, and so they're able to make these decrees. Did the Greeks listen to them? Sometimes, sometimes not. Sometimes not. In 166, in Judah, the Maccabean rebellion against Seleucid rule begins, led by Judas Maccabeus, who was the eldest son of Mattathias. It is, in part, civil war and part war of national liberation. Why would it be, we're talking about the Jews now, quote unquote. Why would there be a civil war among the Jews? Because some of them were Hellenized, and they liked Hellenization, and they agreed with the Hellenists. So we have this division in this small land called Judea by the Romans later, but it is what we know of as quote-unquote Israel at this time. Mainly Yahudim, Benjamites, Levites, with some mixing of the other tribes who had returned. Got that picture? Now, I don't know at what point you're going to be able to see, oh, I see now what's happening in the New Testament with Yeshua. But at some point, I think you will. I think a light bulb will come on for you. Okay, so here's this division. Rome, which has no love for the Seleucid dynasty, is friendly to the rebels. The Maccabean revolt succeeds, and the temple was cleansed in 164, and there was an agreement of sort with Rome, kind of an alliance. So, in a way, you see Daniel coming to fruition here, because Daniel warned about the abomination of desolation. And remember, Daniel also said that there was going to be an alliance, an agreement that was going to negate a covenant. So here you have an alliance. Now, that doesn't mean it's not going to happen at the end time, we know that history repeats itself over and over again, and that Daniel was told, seal it up because it's for the time of the end. Has the end come? Did the end come in 166? No, it did not. So these could be types. But here is this connection, this close connection. Did the Jews really like Rome all that much? No, they just liked them better than the Greeks. Because the Romans still granted them freedom to worship as they liked. And also when we're going through this, and if you should go to this website and read some of this history, look at the comparisons, make comparisons between Rome and the United States of America. I just say that, just saying. Okay, so they get their freedom. They're an independent, but they're not totally free. They're free in the sense that, hey, they're free of Greece, and they don't mind being under Rome so much because Rome lets them do their own thing. Got that? This is what happened in the Intertestament. This is why there's not a lot of conflict. Oh, there's conflict within Judah. Judeans, there really is. In 141, after more than 25 years of rebellion, Jewish rebels drive the last of the Syrians out of Judea. And you see, when we say that they got their independence back, that their rebellion succeeded in 166, it only succeeded for that little group of people down there. It didn't include all of what we look at as Israel, even anciently. It was just that little group around Jerusalem. Okay? For 25 years, they're fighting against Hellenization. They do continue to fight that. And they drive, finally, the last of the Syrians out of what the Romans came to call Judea. With the strength of Rome behind the rebellion, Judea wins formal independence, an independent Jewish state, or a state of Israel, for the first time in more than 400 years. So here we are. We've come to 400 years, and what the historian is telling us, that they were not independent those 400 years. They were allowed some self-rule, but they always were over, or there was always a foreign government over them, either the Greeks or now coming down, we're beginning to see the Romans. Another thing the Greeks would not let them do is they would not let them send the temple tax. Now, see, we don't know much about the temple tax, but it's what kept the temple. It's what kept the temple going. And even those in the diaspora who understood the Torah, they would store up their temple tax, and they'd send a whole caravan with that wealth, guarded, mind you, to Jerusalem to put in the temple treasury. The Greeks forbade that. When they said you can't practice your religion, that's one of the things that they wouldn't let them do. The Romans always let them do that. Now, that doesn't mean that they didn't also impose their own taxes, but they let them pay the tax to the temple. Simon Maccabeus is chosen by popular assembly, because they were able to do this, as high priest, despite his lack of qualifications by birth. In other words, he wasn't a Levite. So that must mean that his father wasn't a Levite either. And so already they had begun to pollute the priesthood. He also takes the position of ruler of the nation, ethnarch. He couldn't claim to be a king because the king was the Roman emperor, or was going to be. It was the head of whatever government they were under. He creates, now this is interesting. He creates a festival. Now this is 141, mind you. When was the cleansing of the temple? 166. 20 years later, he creates a festival called Hanukkah to celebrate both Judea's independence and the day that his rule begins. But if you were in a Messianic group, you would be taught that Hanukkah was a celebration of the rededication of the temple. In fact, in the New Testament, there is a statement about Yeshua being in the temple vicinity on the Feast of Dedication. Well, that's the Feast of Dedication, but this is why we know Yeshua he wasn't there to keep it. He was there because that's where the Jews were. Okay? Divisions within Judaism solidify. Divisions. Remember, I said when the Hasmonean rebellion started, it was partly a civil war? Is because the Jews are the Jews divided today? You know, we learned a saying when we went to Israel. I can't remember if it was in the 99 trip or if it was in the 94 trip. If you get 7 Jews together and have a discussion, you'll have 7 different opinions. Well, when they got the Jews, the Yahudim, together here, they had 4 strong opinions. And when we come, and this is where these divisions come from, that Yeshua is confronting in his ministry. Because they were the Sadducees, the Hasidim, or the Pharisees, the ones who became the Pharisees, the Essenes. I don't know what the 4th one was. They only mentioned these 3, but the Essenes. Now, let's think about these divisions here a little bit, and I hope some lights come on. The Sadducees, they were not Levites. They were a mixture of whatever was available to the Yahudim. But this was a political, if you call it that, a group who believed that the emphasis should be on the temple and its services. The temple and its services. That was there. Now, that would make them foes, angry about what Antiochus Epiphanes did, wouldn't it? So it would get them to fight over that. But, you know, they didn't really care about Daniel, about what Daniel said. Now, on the other hand, the Pharisees, the Hasidim, their emphasis was on individual life. They believed in an individual savior. We say, well, we could have been Pharisees. Wait a minute. They believed, and they were the ones who started the synagogue worship. They were joined by lay scribes, the scribes and the Pharisees. They got together, and they started the synagogue worship, by the way, because they didn't really think that it was that important to keep the temple service going, especially after Antiochus polluted it. So they thought we should get together and we should discuss the law. We should midrash. We should midrash, and we should try to adapt the Torah to life as it is today. Sounds reasonable, huh? But what did they use to do that? The oral law. The Sadducees didn't, Daniel makes a very plain statement, doesn't he, in Daniel chapter 12, that there's going to be a resurrection out of the dust of the ground. There's going to be a resurrection. The Sadducees didn't care about Daniel, so they didn't believe in the resurrection. The Pharisees believed that. They believed that statement. But the Pharisees didn't care anything about what Daniel said about the end time, about the Holocaust, about tribulation. You live for today. Today is, you make it today. You make it today. Say what? The Pharisees were not they were not Levites at all. And a lot of them were what we find in the New Testament, lawyers. Because what do lawyers do? Mac's not on there. Lawyers interpret the law. See how that fits together? Lawyers interpret the law. They didn't know who the priests were. They were all mixed up. The Sadducees thought they were, but they weren't genuine. It wasn't, the Maccabees weren't. The statements in history said they were not qualified. Now what happens is that these groups, and then there were the Essenes, by the way, but these groups all get together and and if somebody declares that they're priests, then the rest of them think, well, but they can't be kings. Even though, Messiah is going to be a priest and king. So if somebody declared to be a high priest, they didn't want to recognize that person as the political ruler, as the governor. They wanted to keep those separate. Well, then you had the Essenes. They believed in separation from government and the corrupt religious leaders. How many of you are Essenes? Yeah, well, I think we're more Essenes, aren't we? And they believed in a strict. They thought you don't adapt the Torah to life today. You adapt your life to Torah. Hello. So but they believed in being separate, and they didn't make much. They didn't care who the government was. If the government, as long as the government didn't force them to go against Torah, they were okay with it. They were okay with it. Okay. So these groups continued to develop through the Hasmonean rule until Rome conquers in the 60s and 50s. It takes that long because Rome was always fighting civil wars. But meanwhile, in 135 to 134, Antiochus VII, a descendant of Antiochus Epiphanes IV, reconquered Judea for himself. But it didn't last long because where did they go for help? Rome. 135 to 134. That's all he could manage to hang on to it. He was gone. In 129, Simon's son, Jehonathan, who took the name Hyrcanus I, he reclaimed Judah's independence after Antiochus VII died, and he extended his rule to, get this, remember I told you that foreign powers had put people in Galilee, in Idumea, and in Samaria? Hyrcanus I recaptured all three of those areas. And he punished the Samaritans because the Samaritans hadn't supported the Maccabean rebellion. He burned their temple, their worship place, and their national shrine on Mount Gerizim. And he forced the Idumeans to convert to Judaism. Remember, who were they? They were Arabs, primarily Arabs. They were of the Edomites. So how did he convert them to Judaism? He forced all the men to be circumcised. And I don't know about, the Samaritans seem to already be practicing that, and it doesn't mention the Galileans, but he forced those people to be more like Judaism. And so we come to the New Testament. Just think ahead just a little bit. And remember how the Jews felt about Samaritans. You remember some of the statements by some of the Jews about the speech of the Galileans. And where did Yeshua come from? Galilee. Where did most of his disciples come from? Galilee. The Galileans. And so they were looked down upon by the scribes and the Pharisees already. And so were the Samaritans. And why would they look down on the Idumeans? As we're going to find out, I don't know if we can. We probably can't do that today. We might have to continue this a little bit into next week. But who was the greatest Idumean in your memory? Herod the Great. He was an Idumean. He was an Edomite. Now, he had connections, and of course the Edomites had been, the Idumeans had been forcefully converted, quote unquote. So there's that. Well, we're going to get to some more of that. So Simon's son, Jonathan, was Hyrcanus I. He reclaims Judah's independence after Antiochus dies. He extends his rule to Galilee, Samaria, and Idumea. Samaria had been hostile to the Hasmonean revolt. Hyrcanus destroyed their temple and national shrine on Mount Gerizim. He forced the Idumeans to convert to Judaism through circumcision and everything else that went along with it. And he forced the rest of the Galileans to convert also. With these annexations, he was able to increase the size of Israel's army. See, that's why he did that. That's why he took over those. He needed a bigger army. His army for just little Judea, was not powerful enough to protect himself, to make any other incursions. Of course, he couldn't make those without Rome. And a decree from Rome was obtained that allowed the Jews to observe the Sabbaths and other rites of the laws wherever they were. So the Romans made the decrees to Greek city-states, and like I said before, sometimes they were followed and sometimes not so much. All right, so that brings us down through the 100s down to about 83, which we're going to pick up next time and talk a little bit more. We're going to go from what caused the Romans to come into power and how does that affect. I mean, you know, we see all this friendship between Rome and the Jews. How did they get to be so hostile at the time of Yeshua? We'll find out, okay? So hang on to your notes, and I hope you find this history interesting, even though we're not going through a lot of scripture, but it is background for the scripture of the New Testament and will help us to understand New Testament stuff. So may Yahweh bless you and guard you. May Yahweh make his face shine upon you and give you his favor. May Yahweh lift up his countenance over you and give you his peace. Yivarekeka Yahweh vayishmereka, Ya'er Yahweh panav alecha v'chanecha, Yasa Yahweh panav alecha v'yasem l'ka shalom.